The Man of Steel, the last son of Krypton, the Metropolis Marvel. Whatever you want to call him, Superman is inarguably one of the most iconic characters in the DC universe, and really comic books in general. He is easily one of the most recognizable figures in pop culture, having been in a veritable cornucopia of different forms of media and merchandise, from movies to animated cartoons, mugs, t-shirts, roller coasters, commercials with Jerry Seinfeld.
No superpowers, no super strength.
And of course, video games. Since the days of the Atari 2600, Supes has been headlining such originally named titles as Superman, and don't forget Superman, but unlike his good friend the Caped Crusader, he hasn't really had that much success in the video game industry. In fact, he's headlined what is considered to be one of the worst video games ever made. Of all of the titles starring the big blue Boy Scout, they've all been mediocre at best, and while it's easy to say it's the developers' fault for mishandling the source material or being incompetent, I think there's a deeper rooted issue here. With the recent rumors of the teams behind the Arkham series working on a new game starring the Big S, I feel it necessary to explain just why Superman has never had, and will never have, a game that is both good and faithful to the source material. When it comes to action games, the character you play as, the protagonist, needs to be as straightforward and simple as possible. They can have a personality and even an interesting backstory, but the deeper their different character traits and morals are, the harder it is to avoid having a disconnect between the player and the character, or what's more commonly referred to as my least favorite phrase, ludonarrative dissonance. This results in the character and the player having a strong narrative disconnect, and that's something you don't really want in any experience, but especially not in that of an action game. To the average person, Superman might seem to be an ideal action hero, simple and straightforward. He just punches things and does what's right, but he's actually a lot more nuanced and complex than most would think. On multiple occasions, Superman has felt the weight of being a god, the weight of someone dying at his hands. He's even left the planet due to the immense amount of guilt he felt because of that in the Exile story arc. He's had desires to become a father and have a family and not to just be the defender of Metropolis. He also has rules. He won't kill anyone, he won't destroy things without a purpose, and he'll do whatever is necessary to protect humanity, even sacrifice himself. It's fair to say Superman is one of the most nuanced and really overdeveloped characters out there. While that's all well and good and can result in someone that can be interesting to watch, playing as that character isn't that enjoyable. This is the reason why every Superman game so far hasn't really felt like a game starring Superman. You can punch at civilians and throw their cars for no reason or smash into buildings causing damage for fun. Those are the sort of actions he wouldn't take, but it's a result of the character and the player having two totally different goals. Superman wants to protect the city and all people in it, and the player just wants to do cool shit with his powers. Imagine playing something like Prototype, and every time you landed and crushed a car with the driver still in it, or punched a civilian on accident, your character started having panic and anxiety attacks. That's what playing a game starring Superman would have to be like. Arguably, you could remove the civilians and just plop Superman on Apocalypse or Warworld, but a lot of what makes Superman iconic is his desire to defend humanity. Without that crucial human element, you'd just be playing an action superhero game in some foreign environment, instead of a game starring the Man of Steel. What's just as, if not more important than having a solid protagonist is having a solid cast of antagonists. If you're fighting the same faceless enemies the whole game without any interesting bosses to change things up, it's inevitable that you'll get bored from the lack of variety. That was one of the biggest issues people had with the Arkham series. Fighting the same little bad guys over and over for the whole game gets pretty tedious for some players, and that's why these boss fights with interesting combat mechanics are so important. This is one department in which Superman is severely lacking. The Man of Steel's villains aren't particularly interesting, both in their style and in the way he fights them. There's actually a very wide range in the types of villains he fights. There's a rich bald guy, an artificial intelligence, Superman's old neighbor, a bunch of improved clones of Superman, a robot that runs on kryptonite, and a universe-conquering alien, just to name a few. The designs are interesting, and their actions are interesting, but the fights don't tend to be very interesting. Apart from Lex Luthor without his power suit, Superman kind of just beats his opponents up until they're knocked out, which in a video game can be pretty unengaging. In some cases, though, fights boil down to a different, more uninteresting situation. Superman's greatest weakness, kryptonite, is a recurring deus ex machina in anything involving the character. It essentially weakens or removes all of his Kryptonian powers and makes him a much easier opponent for some of his less powerful villains to handle. Metallo runs on the stuff, Luthor does whatever he can to get a hold of it, Batman keeps it with him at all times just in case. Hell, even Superman himself had to use it to fight off his clone. It's a pretty common way to keep the Man of Steel's power at bay. This, again, doesn't translate to gameplay in any really interesting way. It was actually a problem Saints Row 4 had. In Saints Row 4, you have superpowers up until you do a main mission where some contrived narrative device removed your powers to give your foes an upper hand. That goes against everything you're supposed to do with boss design or mission design in general, but it's a necessary and common component of Superman's mythos. What is most often cited as one of the Man of Steel's biggest issues is that he's too powerful. Apart from his ridiculously named contextual powers like the Super Kiss and Super Ventriloquism, he has an impressively vast array of abilities. Super Strength, Heat Vision, Flight, Super Speed, Super Breath, X-Ray Vision, and each one of them has varying levels of power. Supes has been known to move planets with his Super Strength, run at 10 times the speed of thought, whatever that means, and create laser beams that are miles wide. Superman's abuse of his powers is a constant theme running throughout the entirety of every story involving the hero. The fear of a rogue Superman is one of the most profound fears in the DC universe. A video game where the player had free reign with those powers would be that fear fully realized and wouldn't work for the character. It's similar to why pretty much every superhero game that isn't based on a comic book has a morality system. It creates narrative significance to the player's actions to reflect the choices they've made with their powers, but a Superman game wouldn't have such a luxury, as he'd ultimately have to be 100% Paragon 100% of the time. But even that is not really the biggest issue with the big blue Boy Scout's powers. He is invincible. He has only died a handful of times, and outside of that, he very rarely actually loses a fight. He has endless endurance and can survive anything ranging from lava to a fully fledged supernova. If you've ever played a game where your character couldn't die, or at the very least couldn't lose, then you know how frustrating and overly simple that can feel. Games like Kirby's Epic Yarn are normally condemned for their lack of any sort of consequence to your actions, and that's something a Superman game has to deal with. EA's repetitive mess that was the Superman Returns tie-in game actually tried to get around this problem by giving the city a health bar. While that's an interesting solution, it didn't exactly work out since the city could heal over time. There was no persistent threat or need to act in any sort of timely manner, especially since every problem only chipped away at the city's health by an incredibly minuscule amount. Ultimately, Superman's vast and insurmountable power is the cause for so many problems with balancing and design that having him headline a faithful video game which isn't a mindless, overtly effortless action game is impractical. Superman is one of my personal favorite superheroes. His role in the animated DC movies and shows were incredibly fun to watch. That being said, the character could never work in a game without it being too simple or so much unlike him that it wouldn't even really be a Superman game. The Man of Steel is most interesting when he's not fighting, but instead dealing with the moral ramifications of being what is essentially a god, and an action game wouldn't do that aspect justice. There are ways around some of the problems I've listed, but almost all of them involve stripping away a lot of what defines the character as a whole, and that defeats the entire purpose of creating a game based around him. The developer Rocksteady has shown that making a faithful superhero game can work, given the right material. Just look at the ever-popular Arkham series. Everyone who enjoys those games does so for the fantastic villains, straightforward nature of the character, and wonderfully varied gameplay. Superman, and really almost all of his colleagues, are lacking in all of those aspects, but the Man of Steel specifically is severely lacking. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe he can work, but as far as I can see, making him work while still creating something believable and enjoyable would be just as hard as getting me to accept that this is Lex Luthor.
The red capes are coming. The red capes are coming.